In a packed congressional hearing with 18 million watching live, Jasmine Crockett confronts Stephen Miller over his directive to suspend habeas corpus for immigrants. While Miller defends it as national security, Jasmine unleashes undeniable evidence. Classified DHS data, a whistleblower's confession, and a burned teddy bear from a child who died in custody. Within 72 hours, Miller is under federal investigation, and his career is in flames. What did Jasmine say that made the system turn on its own architect? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. At 9:02 a.m., the heavy doors to room 2141 creaked open. Jasmine Crockett entered alone, her footsteps sharp against the marble, echoing like a clock ticking toward collision. No cameras flashed, no whispers followed. She moved with the stillness of a storm-gathering force. In her hands, a thick, 300-page classified draft labeled Confidential Habeas Corpus Suspensions Protocol. Just the sight of it drained the room of breath. Across from her, Stephen Miller sat composed, fingers steepled, eyes fixed on her with cold calculation. His face barely moved, but the challenge in his stare said everything. No greetings, no gestures. Just silence, taut, loaded, and about to break. The chairman of the Judiciary Subcommittee on Civil Liberties, Representative Andrew Hollister, an independent with a war veteran's glare, cleared his throat and leaned toward the mic. This hearing, he announced, voice low but firm, will examine whether the fundamental rights of persons under U.S. jurisdiction, specifically habeas corpus, can be suspended in the name of immigration control. He paused, scanning the room. Let it be clear, we are not here to debate policy. We are here to decide if policy can trample the Constitution. The CSPAN cameras clicked on. Staffers froze mid-sentence. In the back rows, human rights observers from Amnesty International and the ACLU scribbled notes with white knuckles. At the center of the storm, Jasmine Crockett placed the thick document down on the witness table, opened to the first page, and raised her head. Her gaze cut across the chamber like a blade. Stephen Miller didn't blink. Neither did she. The war for America's moral soul had just begun, and the first shot had been silence. The silence held for a beat longer. Then the storm cracked open. Stephen Miller didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He leaned into the mic with the ease of a man who'd rehearsed his defense in mirrors and closed rooms for years. This, he said, tapping the cover of the 300-page document with two fingers, is not an attack on liberty. It's the only way to stop the invasion at our borders. The word invasion rang louder than anything the mic could amplify. He let it hang, deliberate, like a charge waiting to ignite fear. His posture was pristine, shoulders back, spine straight, palms calm. But there was something in the way he measured his pauses, like every breath had been lawyered in advance. Every nation has the right to protect itself. America is no exception. The chamber stayed still, but the tension shifted. This wasn't a debate, it was a thesis, and Miller was delivering it like scripture carved from fear and framed in patriotism. If habeas corpus becomes a shield for illegal entry, then we've weaponized our own laws against ourselves, he continued, his eyes now briefly scanning the press section as if to ensure the soundbite would reach the evening news intact. What we propose is simple: expedited detention, limited judicial interference, and the prioritization of national sovereignty. If we don't act now, we risk collapse. Then he turned his full gaze back toward Jasmine Crockett, not with hostility, but with the practiced chill of a man who's convinced the law is only as moral as those who write it. This isn't cruelty. It's survival, he finished, hands folding neatly in front of him. For a moment, it felt as though he believed he'd said something righteous. But across the table, Jasmine hadn't moved. Her hands stayed on the draft. Her face didn't shift. Yet something in the room had. A current beneath the surface. A silence no longer neutral. A reckoning about to speak. But whatever illusion of certainty Stephen Miller had built with his careful language shattered the moment Jasmine Crockett opened her mouth. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shift in her seat. But something in the room did. Something primal, something that recognized truth before it even reached the microphone. And what about human rights? She asked slowly, deliberately. Her eyes never left his. Or do you now decide who qualifies as fully human? It wasn't an outburst. It was an indictment, the kind that didn't need volume because it carried weight. A hush swept through the chamber, not out of respect, but in the way people go silent when they sense a line has been crossed and someone intends to drag it back. Jasmine lifted a small remote, pressed once. The room dimmed. A video filled the screen behind her. Time-stamped, official, damning. The footage opened with grainy black and white. A modest home in El Paso, Texas. A flash of movement. Federal agents at the door. Then, chaos. Kilmar Abrego Garcia, barefoot, handcuffed, and pulled into the night as his 2 children watched from behind their mother. No warrant shown, no charges read, just a single notation on the agent's tablet. Suspected MS-13 affiliation. Jasmine let the video play uninterrupted. The footage shifted to an ICE facility, rows of cots, harsh fluorescent light, and a single shot of Kilmar sitting alone, unmoving, as an officer read from a clipboard with no translator present. Then the final frame, his daughter, only 8 years old, pressing both palms against the glass during a visitation. Her lips moved, silent. Her fingers trembled. On the other side, Kilmar mouthed something. Maybe I'm sorry, maybe I'll come home. But the moment broke something deeper than policy. It cracked the illusion of order. Jasmine turned back to the mic. Her voice didn't waver. He had no criminal record, not even a parking ticket. She paused, the silence swallowing every cough, every breath in the chamber. His only offense was the color of his skin and where he was born. She didn't need to say more. In that moment, everyone in that room saw the truth. This wasn't about borders. It was about lines drawn by fear and who gets erased behind them. The image on the screen faded to black, but its ghost lingered. Kilmar's daughter, her small hands pressed against a pane of glass, still etched into every pair of eyes in that room. Some officials stared down, some blinked too often, others didn't move at all. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless for a beat, letting the silence solidify, letting guilt settle into the hollow that truth had carved out. But she wasn't finished. Not with emotion, not with empathy, not with evidence. That had been the human cost. Now came the ideology that permitted it. And as she reached calmly into the binder at her side, the air inside room 2141 tightened again. This time with dread. This next part is harder to watch, she said, not theatrically, but with the flat, heavy tone of someone preparing the room for an autopsy. From her folder, she withdrew a slim set of pages, cleanly printed, dated, cross-referenced. These, she continued, raising the packet with one hand, are verified emails obtained in 2019. Emails in which Mr. Miller repeatedly shared material from websites known for promoting white nationalist ideology. The words didn't echo. They struck. A few heads turned sharply. Others didn't move at all. It was the kind of moment where no one knew whether to breathe or brace. She stepped to the side and rested the pages on the elevated committee table. Then she opened to a specific email, highlighted, dated October 2015, and read aloud with the calm clarity of a surgeon exposing rot. We need to focus on building a population that matches American DNA. Her voice didn't falter. She didn't add commentary. She let the words infect the air on their own. A ripple passed through the room. The chairman straightened in his chair, eyes narrowing. A court stenographer paused mid-keystroke. Reporters glanced at one another, mouths parted slightly. Not from surprise, but from the struggle of processing what had just been said in a congressional hearing under oath. It wasn't a slip. It wasn't satire. It was a sentence that had lived in a federal inbox and now echoed through the halls of American democracy like a confession. Jasmine looked up from the page, scanning the room deliberately. Stephen Miller, October 2015. She didn't look at Miller when she said it. She looked at the room. She looked at the system. She looked at every person who had sat quietly as one man's pen turned prejudice into policy. She placed the email face up on the table, fingers pressed flat, as if anchoring it to the world so no one could look away. And then she spoke. Not loudly, but slowly, purposefully, each word drawn from a well deeper than outrage. This isn't about protecting the border. It's about protecting a myth, one that says only certain people deserve to call this country home. A heavy breath exhaled somewhere behind her. On the far right side of the committee dais, a Republican congressman shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hand hovering between his notepad and the button to mute his mic. Two others quietly rose from their seats, eyes averted, and slipped out through the side door without a word. Their footsteps echoed like confessions. Jasmine didn't acknowledge them. Her focus remained forward. Miller, for his part, sat still, but his jaw had tightened. He didn't speak. For the first time that morning, he didn't even try to smile. The tension in the room was no longer just political. It was existential. What had begun as a legal hearing on habeas corpus had now cracked open something deeper, something rotten at the root. Jasmine had pulled back the curtain, not just on a man, but on a mindset. A quiet war waged in documents, decisions, and digital trails. And as the truth settled in, no one in the room could pretend it hadn't been there all along. They just stopped looking. She had forced them to see. But Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't grandstand. She simply stood by the evidence, hands steady, voice calm, and let the truth speak for itself. Because sometimes justice doesn't shout. Sometimes it just shows you what was always there and dares you to keep denying it. The sting of Jasmine's final words still clung to the air like static. Only certain people deserve to call this country home. The room was motionless, caught between the weight of moral exposure and the discomfort of knowing it was true. Some shifted in their seats, others sat frozen. But Stephen Miller, ever composed, never panicked. He straightened slowly, like a man who'd been waiting for this very moment, not to apologize, but to reassert control. His fingers curled once, then rested lightly on the edge of the microphone. When he spoke, it wasn't with fire, it was with ice. The Constitution makes allowances in times of national emergency, he began, his voice steady, almost soothing in its detachment. The phrase national emergency landed like a gavel, sharp, final, unyielding. Everything we've done, everything I've proposed, falls within the executive authority granted under such conditions. He paused, eyes scanning the chamber, not pleading, not persuading, but warning. His tone shifted subtly, becoming tighter, more deliberate. What's happening at our borders isn't routine. It's a crisis, an existential threat to the stability of our nation. His gaze lingered on the chairman just long enough to imply a shared responsibility, then moved toward the back where cameras blinked and pens raced. It was no longer a defense. It was a blueprint for authority unchecked. In emergencies, the government has the duty, not the option, the duty to act decisively. His hands pressed together, fingertips touching like a man reciting scripture. There was no remorse in his posture, no shadow of regret. This wasn't about damage control. This was doctrine. And if we hesitate because some find the methods uncomfortable, he said, his voice tightening into the kind of clipped edge only policy language can carry, then we fail in our most basic responsibility, to protect the American people. He didn't refute the email. He didn't mention Kilmar. He didn't even glance at Jasmine. It was calculated. He knew invoking legality would shift the room, turn morality into opinion, turn pain into procedural debate. In doing so, he redirected the fire, not to extinguish it, but to smother it in rules. But beneath that legal scaffolding, one truth remained unspoken yet visible in every unsmiling face in that room. Miller wasn't defending democracy. He was defending the machinery that could operate without soul, without scrutiny, so long as it called itself legal. And Jasmine Crockett? She wasn't just questioning the machine. She was threatening to unplug it. The room, already strained by Miller's invocation of emergency powers, now felt like it was holding its breath. His justification, precise, procedural, sterile, had been carefully laid out like a fortress built on the foundation of fear. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't aiming to shout over it. She intended to dismantle it, brick by brick, word by word, using the only weapon stronger than fear in a democracy, the Constitution itself. She leaned forward, her tone calm but unyielding, the cadence of someone who didn't need to dramatize the truth because it already carried more weight than any performance could. Article 1, Section 9 of the United States Constitution, she said clearly, each word deliberate, each syllable like a drumbeat of accountability. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. She let that sit, not as opinion, but as law carved into the very bones of the nation. Then came the strike. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't have to. Her delivery cut sharper for its restraint. And right now, you're manufacturing a fake crisis to justify a discriminatory agenda. No theatrics, no hyperbole, just precision. Crockett wasn't accusing Miller of overreach. She was accusing him of fabrication, a deliberate, cynical construction of crisis to serve an agenda rooted in exclusion. And this time, the argument wasn't emotional, it was constitutional. Across the room, Miller's practiced posture broke. The steeple of his fingers dropped to the table. He didn't respond immediately. His eyes darted, first to the committee chair, then to the press row, and finally, reluctantly, to the attorneys seated just behind him. One leaned forward, whispering quickly, quietly, urgently. Miller didn't nod. His jaw locked. A single muscle twitched at the base of his cheek, a minor betrayal of the control he'd fought to maintain all morning. The moment didn't explode. It cracked, quietly, deeply. What had been posed as legal strategy now stood exposed as constitutional fiction. Jasmine hadn't just countered his narrative. She had peeled it back and read aloud the line where it broke federal law. She wasn't grandstanding. She was excavating. And the silence that followed was filled not with noise, but with the weight of what had just been revealed. And in that silence, the room finally understood. Stephen Miller had built his argument on emergency, but Jasmine Crockett had just reminded the nation that emergency does not erase the Constitution. The silence that followed Jasmine's constitutional takedown was dense, tense with the weight of a truth that couldn't be unspoken. But she didn't stop. She didn't pause to revel or retreat. She turned the page, literally and figuratively, and moved to the part of the hearing few were prepared to confront, the racial architecture beneath the policy itself. If Miller's arguments had hidden behind legality, she was about to strip that cover away and put its moral logic on trial. She lifted another folder from the stack beside her. This one wasn't marked confidential, but its contents were no less explosive. Let's talk about a policy implemented under your direction in early 2025, she said, unfolding a set of State Department documents under the soft hum of overhead lights. A targeted refugee program, quietly launched, quietly approved, offering fast-tracked entry and visa relief for Afrikaner families from South Africa, citing persecution based on race. A few in the room looked up, confused. Others looked down, uncomfortable. But Jasmine didn't waver. She spread the documents in front of her like a prosecutor laying out the final row of evidence. According to DHS records, over 7,400 white South African applicants, primarily Afrikaners, were granted entry under this specialized status within the first 6 months of the program. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped, slower, more deliberate, like she was daring the facts to be challenged. Then she held up another page, high enough for the cameras to catch, a printed chart marked in bold red. And during that exact same period, same time frame, same agency, same approval board, requests from Haitian and Syrian refugees dropped by more than 63%. She let the numbers speak for themselves, let the contrast bleed through, and then, with a quiet breath that carried the fire of 1,000 unheard voices, she drove the point home. If this isn't a race-based policy, she said, locking eyes with Miller across the table, then what exactly do you call it? The room didn't erupt. It recoiled, a slow, collective pullback of posture, of denial, of comfort. This wasn't just about who got in. It was about who was designed to stay out. A handful of aides exchanged glances. One congressman on the far end folded his arms so tightly his knuckles whitened. Another pulled out his phone, pretending to check the time, but failing to hide the discomfort crawling up his spine. Miller opened his mouth slightly but said nothing. For once, the architecture of his rhetoric, so carefully built, so strategically deployed, offered him no exit. He looked at the table, then at the papers Jasmine had laid bare. The math didn't lie. The categories didn't lie, and Jasmine had drawn a line so sharp it didn't leave room for spin, only for answers. But she didn't demand one. She didn't press him. She just let the question hang in the air. 16 simple words that echoed louder than any policy briefing. If this isn't a race-based policy, then what exactly do you call it? The silence that followed wasn't like the others. It wasn't defensive or shocked or procedural. It was guilty. Not in the legal sense, but in the way people look at something they know is wrong and realize they were complicit in pretending otherwise. A moral silence. A silence of reckoning. Jasmine let it sit. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't look away. She wanted them all, every person in that room, every viewer watching at home, to feel the full weight of what selective compassion looks like when written in visa quotas and signed by the same hand that wrote speeches about border integrity. What she had done in that moment was not just expose a policy. She had peeled back the lie that immigration control was ever about security alone. She had shown the country that the gate had never been shut. It had been designed to open for some and lock for others. And the man sitting across from her had drawn that design in ink and defended it in plain sight. But now his silence said everything his words never could. The silence from her last line had not yet settled before Jasmine moved again. Not with outrage, not with rhetoric, but with something far more devastating. Memory. The legal arguments had been made, the charts had been displayed, the Constitution invoked. But now came the truth that no statute could erase. A truth that wasn't spoken in policy language, but in the language of grief. She reached into a slim, flat case beneath her documents, not quickly, not theatrically, but with the reverence of someone lifting something sacred. And from it, she pulled a small, faded teddy bear. It was charred on one ear. The seams were loose, one button eye missing, yet it radiated presence, instantly changing the temperature of the room. This was no prop. This was evidence of the kind no lawyer could redact. She held it in both hands, pressing it lightly to her chest, before placing it on the witness table in front of her. Her voice dropped, not in volume, but in weight. Her name was Mariana. She was 7 years old. Her mother carried her across the border near Eagle Pass in 2021. They were fleeing cartel violence, seeking asylum. Instead, they were placed in detention. The words came slowly, evenly, not to dramatize, but to give weight to a story no one had wanted to carry. She developed a fever, Jasmine continued, eyes locked on the bear, as if speaking both to the room and to the child no longer here. They asked for a doctor. None came. They begged for help. It never arrived. Her jaw tightened, but her tone did not waver. 48 hours later, Mariana died in a locked room with fluorescent lights and no windows. No one moved. The silence this time wasn't political, it was personal. Jasmine reached out and gently touched the edge of the bear's scorched fabric, brushing the burnt seam with her thumb. She wasn't just telling a story, she was presenting a wound. This is what her mother gave me, after the funeral, after the burial, after the system told her it was no one's fault. Then, and only then, did she lift her eyes and aim them squarely at Stephen Miller. Her voice was level, but there was steel behind every word. This is the last thing left from a child who died under a policy you designed. She didn't look away. She didn't blink. She let the bear sit there in silence, its presence more damning than any headline. No camera crew could fully capture what was happening, because this wasn't just testimony, it was reckoning. The bear didn't cry, it didn't scream, but it spoke more loudly than any witness ever could. It said what the facts alone could not, that behind every executive order was a life, and sometimes the loss of one. The silence that followed Jasmine's final line was not the kind that fades. It was the kind that sinks, seeps, and stays. The scorched teddy bear remained on the table like a silent indictment, its presence undeniable, its meaning unspoken yet deafening. Most in the room sat frozen, gripped by a quiet that held the weight of something irreversible. But not Stephen Miller. He didn't retreat into that stillness. He struck against it, loud and visceral, as though noise might undo what truth had revealed. His voice sliced into the room like a sharp edge, desperate to reclaim authority. The carefully measured calm that had defined his earlier testimony was gone, replaced now by something raw, anger twisted in defense. "This is character assassination," he snapped, his jaw tight, the microphone catching the unsteady force beneath his words. His eyes narrowed on Jasmine, not with policy debate, but with personal accusation. Congresswoman Crockett isn't interested in law or security. She's here to inflame racial resentment. The words rang out like a signal flare, one not meant to illuminate but to provoke. His hands, once folded in precision, now hovered, agitated, barely restrained. "She is weaponizing personal tragedy to stoke hatred toward white Americans. That's what this is. That's what it's always been." The line landed hard, not because it was unexpected, but because it was familiar. The oldest defense against accountability, to recast exposure as attack, to label truth as threat. He scanned the room looking for validation, for someone to nod or even shift in agreement. But the silence that met him was colder than before, less stunned, more disgusted. Still, he doubled down, voice hardening into disbelief, panic just beneath the surface. If anyone else spoke the way she just did, if they held up race as the sole measure of policy, this room would erupt. He jabbed a pointed finger toward Jasmine, not high enough to be called a threat, but just sharp enough to try and draw blood. "But because it's aimed at people like me, it's considered righteous? Fair?" And then the final fracture, his voice cracked, the tone of power giving way to one of desperate indignation. "This isn't oversight. It's a political lynching dressed up as justice." The words dropped like lead. Even those seated behind him, legal staff, aides, conservative allies, shifted uncomfortably. Not because they didn't understand what he meant, but because in that moment it was clear he had no idea what he had become. Not a man defending a policy, but a man cornered by the truth of what that policy had cost. And Jasmine? She didn't flinch. She didn't rise. She simply sat, still, steady, unshaken. Because sometimes the most powerful response is to let a man be destroyed by the sound of his own voice. Miller's outburst still lingered in the air, jagged and bitter, like smoke after a flash fire. His final words, "A political lynching dressed up as justice," were meant to provoke, to destabilize, to force Jasmine into anger. But they failed. She didn't flinch. She didn't rise. And most telling of all, she didn't lower herself. Instead, she moved with quiet control, the kind that comes from surviving storms far worse than this. Her fingers, steady and sure, lifted a single page from the stack before her. No showmanship, no need for drama. Truth was more than enough. "Hatred," she said, her voice firm but low, "is what you planted. I'm just here cleaning up the wreckage." The room didn't react with gasps or outrage. It froze. Because the line didn't need to be shouted to be heard. It was felt. It was lived. Jasmine held the page up briefly before laying it down again, turning it just slightly toward the committee chairman and the cameras behind him. "This document is from an internal audit by the Department of Homeland Security," she stated, enunciating each word with the clarity of someone who knew the burden of being doubted. "It wasn't leaked. It wasn't partisan. It's official, time-stamped, and reviewed by oversight staff within DHUs just 6 months ago." She tapped her index finger on the bottom of the page. A soft sound, but it struck like a gavel. "It shows that 73% of individuals denied their right to appeal under your expedited removal framework were either Black or Latino." Her gaze swept the room, not pleading, not theatrical, but confrontational in the most exacting sense. Not because they posed a threat, not because they failed to qualify, but because of who they were, what they looked like, where they came from. No one interrupted, not even Miller. He sat still, hands clasped tightly together now, as if gripping onto the last remaining threads of plausible deniability. The legal team behind him exchanged glances, no longer whispering strategies, but watching as the ground beneath them eroded inch by inch. Jasmine didn't press the moment further. She didn't need to. The data had spoken. The disparity was real. The silence it summoned was not one of uncertainty. It was the silence of recognition, of complicity, of a system finally being shown a mirror it couldn't turn away from. And Jasmine, she simply leaned back, her eyes unwavering. Because in that moment, she hadn't just dismantled a policy, she had exposed a pattern, a truth, a structure of discrimination buried beneath the language of national security. And now that it had been named, it couldn't be unseen. The evidence was undeniable. The room had fallen into a heavy, breathless quiet. Not because Jasmine Crockett had shouted, but because she hadn't needed to. Her words, her documents, and that single scorched teddy bear had done what years of political theater had failed to do: make injustice feel real. But the story didn't stop inside room 2141. In fact, it had just begun to explode beyond it. Because while the chamber sat still, the internet ignited. Across the nation, and then the globe, the live stream surged. What began as a standard congressional oversight hearing had gone viral in real time, catching fire within minutes of Jasmine's confrontation with Stephen Miller. Viewership hit 1 million, then 2, then 5. By the time she held up the internal DHS report and laid bare the racial imbalance in Miller's policy, over 18 million people were watching. In just under 2 hours, her words were being translated, subtitled, clipped, and shared across every platform imaginable, from TikTok to Twitter, from Instagram to cable news banners. But it wasn't the charts or even the moment Miller lost control that captivated the world. It was one sentence, a single line, delivered with quiet fury, now etched into history. America doesn't need a DNA filter to define the right to live. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't written by staff. It was raw, unscripted, and undeniable. That one sentence became the spark. Within minutes, it was a TikTok audio trend. Within an hour, it was on protest signs in front of federal buildings in 7 different states. The hashtags came fast and hit hard. Crockett versus hate trended #1 on Twitter. Miller files hit 2.3 million posts in under 5 hours. Memes were created, yes, but so were movements. Teachers played her speech in classrooms. Activists stitched her words into denim jackets. And somewhere between viral and historic, the moment became something else entirely, irreversible. Then came the crack that no one expected, but everyone had been waiting for. A former DHS official, someone who had worked directly under the expedited removal program Miller once championed, released a video. It wasn't flashy. It was shot in a parked car with low lighting and a shaking voice. The man, who had never spoken publicly before, looked directly into the camera and said, "We were ordered to bypass process, told to reject appeals, even when we knew they had merit. We were told to flag names by origin, not evidence. We knew it was wrong. We did it anyway. We were scared. But today, after what I saw in that room, I can't stay silent. We were forced to break the law." The clip shattered the digital sphere. It was picked up by every major outlet. The Department of Homeland Security issued a formal statement within hours, saying they would review all operational guidance issued during the 2025 re-implementation of border protocols. But the damage had already pierced the membrane of plausible deniability. This wasn't just about policy anymore. It was about command, about deliberate strategy, about what had been built and who had been hurt in silence. As the hours passed, Jasmine Crockett's name trended not just in political circles, but in homes, in classrooms, in boardrooms. Artists painted murals of her holding the burned bear. Civil rights groups demanded congressional follow-up. Immigration lawyers began compiling evidence for federal class action suits. And through it all, one image kept circulating: a still frame of Jasmine, seated in the chamber, holding the bear to her chest, eyes locked on Miller, moments before she said, "This is the last thing left from a child who died under a policy you designed." That image, paired with her DNA filter quote, was now framed in thousands of posts, headlines, and digital billboards. No one could pretend they hadn't seen it. And those who once tried to keep the conversation buried behind bureaucratic shields now found themselves exposed. The illusion of technocratic neutrality had been broken, and in its place stood something far more powerful: a reckoning that could be named, traced, and now proven. The response wasn't universal praise. Critics attacked, Networks scrambled to reframe, but even they couldn't stop the tidal wave of clarity that had just swept across a divided country. In a political world built on spectacle, what had struck deepest that day wasn't performance. It was truth, unflinching, documented, and most importantly, seen. And as millions watched Jasmine Crockett walk out of that hearing room with nothing in her hands but a stack of truth and a burned teddy bear, the message had already reached further than any legislation ever could. No more hiding behind policy. No more silence in the name of order. The system had spoken, and this time, someone had finally spoken back. The hearing room had become a battlefield where truth had finally drawn blood. Jasmine Crockett's words, the evidence, the scorched bear, all of it had pushed the line beyond rhetoric and into something irreversible. Millions had watched it unfold in real time, but inside room 2141, where the air still hung thick with the weight of exposed injustice, a decision now loomed, one that would not simply conclude a hearing, but potentially ignite a national reckoning. And it would begin with a single question: would Congress act, or would it once again flinch in the face of its own reflection? Chairman Andrew Hollister, a war-hardened independent known for his blunt manner and unwillingness to be swayed by party lines, adjusted his glasses and spoke into the mic. His voice was measured, but the tension beneath it was unmistakable. This committee has heard sworn testimony, reviewed classified documentation, and received public declarations from career federal officials. The allegations presented are not policy disagreements. They are potential violations of federal law and basic human rights. He paused, scanning the semicircle of lawmakers, his eyes lingering on each of them. Not as colleagues, but as jurors. Therefore, pursuant to our oversight authority, I am calling for a motion to vote. Shall this committee formally refer all findings and evidence from today's proceedings to the Department of Justice for a full federal investigation into Mr. Stephen Miller's role in the alleged systemic denial of due process and violations of civil and human rights under United States law? You could feel the air shift, the kind of pressure that comes when the room realizes history is about to etch itself in ink. Staffers stiffened. Reporters leaned in. Miller, still seated, no longer wore the same air of defiance. His jaw was clenched, hands white-knuckled as he gripped the arms of his chair. He wasn't in control anymore. He was waiting, watching, cornered by the very mechanisms of the system he once weaponized. The vote began. Each member's name was called, and each answered into the mic with clarity and weight. Yes, yes, a pause. No, then yes, another yes, then another. The count moved forward like a slow, rising drumbeat, steady, unstoppable, final. One of the committee's most conservative members looked visibly torn, tapping their pen against the desk, eyes darting toward Miller, then toward the public gallery where a DHS whistleblower sat with folded arms. After a breathless moment, she spoke. Yes. By the time the final vote was cast, you could hear the exhale ripple across the room like a tide breaking against the walls of denial. Hollister nodded, gave no theatrical flourish, and announced what everyone now knew was coming. By a vote of 10-3, this committee moves to refer all relevant documents, sworn testimony, and digital evidence to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation. No cheers, no applause, just stunned silence, followed by the rustle of papers and the furious typing of journalists. One aide stood and quietly delivered the sealed recommendation folder to the clerk, who walked it out of the room like it contained the future itself. Because maybe it did. Stephen Miller didn't speak, didn't blink. His face, drained of color, now wore the look not of someone who had lost a debate, but of someone who had been named. Not a political operative, not a strategist, but a potential defendant. Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply gathered her papers, pressed her hand once more to the bear resting beside them, and stood. Her final glance at the committee table was not one of victory, but of responsibility. Because this wasn't over. This was only the beginning. And now the machinery of accountability had been set into motion. Slow, heavy, and, for once, pointed in the right direction. The gavel had barely struck its final note when the undercurrent in room 2141 began to shift, no longer humming with legal argument, but reverberating with something deeper, more primal. It wasn't victory, it wasn't resolution, it was fallout. Jasmine Crockett had exited the chamber like a woman who had delivered both truth and burden, leaving behind not just scorched paper trails and shattered denials, but a silence no official statement could cover. The bear was gone, the charts were closed. But what remained was the weight of everything that had been seen, heard, and no longer deniable. And at the center of that wreckage stood one man, pale, silent, undone. Stephen Miller hadn't moved since the vote. For minutes that felt like hours, he sat in his chair as if it might protect him from the reality crashing down on the other side of the table. His fingers rested on his lap, clenched tightly, not in defiance but in something far more fragile, disbelief. The once composed architect of border walls and wartime rhetoric now looked like a figure from a crumbling painting. Details washed out by exposure. The camera still rolled. Every angle captured the disintegration, not of policy, but of posture. The man who had designed so many walls was, in this moment, defenseless. When he finally stood, it wasn't with the confidence of a public servant. It was with the heaviness of a man carrying the weight of knowing that his name would no longer be written in footnotes, but in federal investigations. His legs were stiff, his shoulders, usually squared in self-importance, slumped forward. The skin around his mouth had lost all color, lips pressed into a narrow, bloodless line. He reached for his folder, only to stop halfway, as if realizing there was nothing inside that could help him now. With a trembling hand, he tucked the papers under his arm and turned toward the exit. But there was no quiet escape waiting for him. The doors opened, and with them came the blinding white storm of flash photography and broadcast chaos. Outside the chamber, the corridor had transformed into a gauntlet of accountability. Reporters surged forward like a wave held back for too long. Boom mics and camera rigs swung into position. Every lens was trained on him, not as a public figure, but as a man suddenly and irreversibly under the weight of consequence. Mr. Miller, do you deny the internal DHS findings? Why were appeals denied to 73% of Black and Latino asylum seekers? Did you authorize fast-track deportations against legal counsel advice? Do you accept responsibility for Mariana's death? Will you resign before the DOJ investigation begins? The questions came rapid fire, each one sharper than the last, but Miller didn't answer. He didn't even raise his eyes. There was no rebuttal, no indignation, just silence. A silence now louder than anything he could have said. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscle twitched beneath his cheekbone. His breasts were short, barely visible. He walked like a man shrinking from his own legacy, not escaping it. Each step echoed off the marble floor, chased by camera shutters and unanswered demands. He passed by a digital screen in the hallway where the live stream replayed on loop. Jasmine Crockett's voice rang through the static. Hatred is what you planted. I'm just here cleaning up the wreckage. He kept walking, but those watching didn't miss the way his eyes flickered toward the screen, or the way his pace faltered ever so slightly, as if her words, repeated now by millions, had finally pierced the layers of armor built over years of power and immunity. No one walked beside him. The aides who had once orbited him like loyal satellites now lingered at a distance, waiting to see what gravity might claim him. One reached forward hesitantly with a tablet, perhaps offering notes or a prepared statement, but Miller waved it away with a weak shake of the head. Not today. Not after what had just been said, proven, and broadcast to every corner of the nation. Outside the building, a crowd had gathered, not chanting, not yelling, just watching. Phones were raised. Some had signs, simple, devastating words like, due process is not optional, Mariana deserved better, and policy is not immunity. As Miller descended the steps, his foot caught slightly on the edge of the last one, forcing him to pause for the briefest of moments before regaining his footing. To some it was nothing, but to others it was everything. A glimpse of the man behind the policies, stripped of myth, of spin, of protection. A black SUV waited at the curb, its back door opened by a driver who didn't say a word. Miller ducked inside, head still low, hands visibly shaking now as he fumbled with the seatbelt. Cameras caught every frame as the door shut with a dull thud. Within seconds, the vehicle pulled away, but not fast enough to escape the message that now hung over the Capitol like a storm cloud waiting to break. The video of his silent walk trended within minutes. The hashtags Miller Collapse, Crockett Truth, Injustice Begins Now surged across every major platform. Some edited his exit alongside Jasmine's final lines. Others overlaid it with the haunting image of Mariana's burned bear. But all told the same story. This was no longer just a hearing. It was the beginning of accountability. Stephen Miller had once been the man behind the curtain, unseen, unchallenged, untouchable. But now he had walked through the storm he created. And for the first time, the world saw not power, not brilliance, not strategy, but consequence. He left no final quote, no spin, no fire. Only the sound of the truth catching up to him, and the echo of a door closing behind him that sounded far too much like history turning the page. The SUV carrying Stephen Miller had long disappeared into the gray arteries of Washington, but its exit didn't signal the end. If anything, it was the closing of one chapter, the one written in secrets, loopholes, and silence. Inside the Capitol, the air was heavier now, not with tension, but with the undeniable weight of truth that had just been unearthed, broadcast, and etched into the public memory. Jasmine Crockett hadn't planned to speak again. She hadn't prepared a statement, hadn't coordinated with media teams or speechwriters, but truth has a rhythm of its own, and it doesn't wait for press conferences. And so, as the hearing room emptied and the world leaned forward, she walked straight into the rotunda where the press had already gathered, the nation holding its breath. She stood at the edge of the podium alone, no entourage, no aides at her side. The light above her cast a quiet glow against the granite floor. In her right hand, the black folder containing evidence, testimony, and federal admissions. In her left, the bear, burned, battered, but still intact. The very object that had turned a cold policy hearing into a moral reckoning. Reporters surged forward, drawn not by the anticipation of a political statement, but by something rarer. A woman who had just shifted the national narrative, standing before them without the shield of spin. She looked across the room and waited not for silence, but for stillness, waited for the cameras to stop blinking, the shuffling to cease, the questions to retreat into their microphones. And when that moment came, a breathless quiet with millions watching from every screen in America, Jasmine Crockett spoke. Power, she said, her voice calm, resonant, and cutting, was never meant to suppress. It was meant to protect. The words didn't thunder. They bled into the room like truth finally finding oxygen. Every syllable fell with purpose, and every face turned just a little more toward her, not because they were told to listen, but because they couldn't not. She didn't blink, didn't shift. She had said the line before, in smaller rooms to quieter crowds. But today, with the full weight of the system around her, it hit like a bell tolling deep inside the soul of the nation. Her eyes swept across the chamber, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement. We've seen what happens when power forgets its purpose, and she continued, her voice unwavering. We've seen it in the cages, in the denials, in the stamped papers with no explanation but country of origin. We've seen it in the children who never made it out of holding cells, in families separated with no plan to reunite, in courts that never opened, in hearings that never happened. She paused, not to catch her breath, but to let everyone else find theirs. Then slowly, she lifted the bear, soft, scorched, silent, and held it up just high enough for every camera, every spectator, every American to see. This is not policy, she said. This is not partisanship. This is what's left when compassion is replaced by calculation. Her thumb brushed along the stitched ear. Her name was Mariana. She was 7 years old, and she is gone. Not because of an accident, not because of a misunderstanding, but because somewhere along the way, someone decided her life wasn't worth the same due process as anyone else's. Some in the crowd wiped tears. Others simply stared, transfixed. The bear was no longer a prop. It was a mirror, and every person watching could now see themselves reflected in the system that had failed a child. Jasmine's tone sharpened, not louder but more precise. "When you choose who gets to live," she said, locking eyes with the press corps, "you stop being a public servant and become a judge of worth. But here, life does not wait for permission." The silence that followed didn't last long. It started with a single person in the gallery, an older woman in a gray coat, who stood up and began to clap. Then another, and another. Then the press. Then lawmakers who had been watching from behind pillars and cameras. One by one, people stood, not in politeness, but in understanding. The room filled not with noise, but with an energy that hadn't been felt in that rotunda in years. It wasn't applause for a politician. It was recognition of something far more rare, moral clarity in a place built to avoid it. The ovation thundered. Across the nation, phones buzzed with notifications. The clip of Jasmine's closing words was already flooding every social feed. Editors scrambled to revise their headlines. TV anchors went off script. Hashtags surged again. #, right to live. #, Crockett speaks. #, power to protect. Advocacy groups began organizing candlelight vigils, not for political protest, but for remembrance. For Mariana, for Kilmar, for the families never shown on screen. But Jasmine didn't raise her hand in triumph. She didn't wave or take a bow. She simply stepped back from the podium and laid the bear down gently, right in the center of it. An offering, a memory, and a warning. The camera zoomed in, and in that single frame, no flags, no slogans, no banners, was all the proof America needed. Justice had finally been spoken aloud. As she turned to leave, a reporter called out, "Congresswoman, what now?" Jasmine stopped mid-stride. She didn't turn around. She just spoke. Quiet, grounded, final. "Now, we make sure it never happens again." And with that, she walked down the marble corridor, her steps echoing into the history she had just rewritten. 3 days had passed, but the country hadn't taken its eyes off room 2141. The scorched teddy bear, the standing ovation, the silence of Stephen Miller as he vanished into a black SUV without a word. It all lingered, not just in headlines, but in living rooms, classrooms, Senate briefings, and whispered conversations in places that rarely spoke of justice. Jasmine Crockett had ignited something larger than a hearing. She had exposed not just one man, but an entire system's quiet collusion. And America had done what it rarely does so quickly. It listened. It watched. It demanded a response. And that response came, quietly, but with the full weight of law behind it, on the morning of the third day. At 7:43 a.m., the Department of Justice issued a formal press release. No leaks, no preamble. Just 12 devastating words in bold typeface. "A federal investigation into Stephen Miller has been formally opened." The rest of the statement read like a verdict already underway. The Office of Civil Rights and the Public Integrity Section would jointly oversee the probe. The investigation would examine Miller's potential abuse of executive authority, his alleged orchestration of discriminatory policy targeting asylum seekers by race and nationality, and credible reports of systemic due process violations under his advisement. It confirmed that whistleblower testimony, classified DHS communications, and congressional evidence, including the DHS internal report introduced by Representative Jasmine Crockett, had been submitted as primary exhibits. Within minutes, the country ignited again. Every major network cut into regular programming. Cable news anchors leaned forward, brows raised, voices hushed in a way reserved only for moments that shift history. The press, who only days earlier had chased Miller through Capitol corridors, now lined up outside the DOJ's Civil Rights Division in D.C., broadcasting live under banners reading, "Miller under federal investigation." Even international outlets picked up the feed. Germany's Der Spiegel called it a reckoning for America's conscience. Al Jazeera led with, "Policy now on trial." But at the center of it all was one unmistakable thread. Someone had finally broken the wall of immunity. Inside the DOJ headquarters, lights didn't flicker on with ceremony. They snapped awake in rows of cubicles, case files, and exhausted but resolute civil rights attorneys who understood the gravity of what had just landed on their desks. For years, they had read the headlines, seen the numbers, watched the footage, but never been empowered to act. Now they weren't being asked to investigate, they were being unleashed. In one office, a team reviewed internal DHS emails sent between Miller's policy office and regional ICE directors. Words like expedite, minimize appeal, and flag origin first began showing patterns. One analyst stared at the metadata and whispered, "This wasn't negligence. It was structure." In another room, the whistleblower who had released the car confession video was scheduled for a full sworn deposition under federal protection. He arrived with a flash drive, 32 folders, all time-stamped, all archived. His hands shook, but his voice was steady. "I should have done this years ago," he said. "I was just waiting for someone to make it safe." And someone had. On Capitol Hill, Jasmine Crockett stood beneath the same marble dome where she had laid down the bear. She didn't speak to the cameras that day. She didn't need to. The Justice Department had spoken for her. But as reporters swarmed her staff for statements, one aide offered a single line, one that echoed through every press room like prophecy. "Truth doesn't just shine, it burns." That same afternoon, outside a courthouse in El Paso, dozens gathered with signs bearing Mariana's name. A local pastor read Jasmine's quote aloud through a bullhorn. "When you choose who gets to live, you stop being a servant and become a judge of worth." The crowd, silent, bowed their heads. Not in defeat, but in defiance of forgetting. Meanwhile, back in D.C., Stephen Miller's legal team released a one-paragraph statement. Mr. Miller categorically denies all allegations. He will cooperate fully to correct the narrative and defend the integrity of his public service. But the cameras caught him entering a private office building hours later, head down, lips pursed, flanked by two lawyers in navy suits. There were no chants, no insults, just the quiet rhythm of justice catching up. 3 steps behind, now only 1 step away. By nightfall, the DOJ building was lit from within. Inside, a war room had been established. Whiteboards tracked timelines, personnel, dates of key policy rollouts. In one corner sat a folder marked Miller Directive 4A, Targeted Removal Acceleration, March 2025. It was signed, stamped, documented. Its language, clinical, coded, spoke of priority indexing by threat profile, a term now understood to mean race. The attorneys worked late, not because of pressure, but because of clarity. They knew what this was. This was not just an investigation into one man. This was a nation finally asking itself, what did we allow? What did we ignore? What now must be undone? And as the midnight hour approached, one of the lead prosecutors closed her laptop, stared at the bear resting quietly on her desk, sent earlier that day by Jasmine Crockett's office, and said to no one in particular, "We owe it to her to finish this." The lights stayed on, the wheels turned, the reckoning at last was in motion. But even as the Justice Department pressed forward, even as hearings gave way to subpoenas and headlines turned to indictments, there was one truth that pulsed beneath the political and legal machinery now in motion. This was never just about Stephen Miller. It wasn't only about one hearing, or one child, or even one vote. It was about a deeper rot, one that had been allowed to settle in the bones of the system for years, unseen because it wore a tie, unchecked because it signed memos instead of swinging batons. And Jasmine Crockett hadn't just exposed it. She had named it, dragged it into the light, and demanded the world reckon with what it saw. But the story's final weight didn't rest on Miller's fate. It rested on what came next, on what we, as a people, were willing to learn from everything that had been torn open. The human lesson was never hidden. It had been there from the moment Jasmine placed a scorched teddy bear on the witness table and asked a nation to remember that justice isn't sterile and policy isn't neutral. The system had told Mariana's mother that her daughter's death was nobody's fault, but Jasmine made it clear, when a system denies care, denies process, denies empathy, it is no longer a system. It is a machine, and machines do not grieve. That was the first lesson, that humanity, when stripped from policy, creates not order but devastation. that in the cold language of security, it is always the innocent who bleed first and longest. The second lesson was harder, more personal, more dangerous. It was this: silence is complicity. Every official who looked the other way, every department that signed off without asking, every leader who spoke in vague platitudes while children disappeared behind barbed wire and bureaucracy. They weren't neutral. They were participants. The machine only worked because good people let it. Jasmine didn't just face Stephen Miller that day. She faced a century of institutional cowardice. And in doing so, she reminded us that neutrality in the face of injustice is not a shield. It is an endorsement. That's why her voice cracked the chamber. Not because it was loud, but because it refused to be quiet anymore. And then came the third lesson, perhaps the most painful of all, that democracy only works if we make it human again. The Constitution is not self-enforcing. Rights do not defend themselves. And power, if not constantly reminded of its purpose, will always tilt toward preservation, not justice. Jasmine didn't walk into that room with just legal knowledge. She walked in with a conscience sharpened by experience, with empathy carved by loss, with anger refined into discipline. She showed us what happens when one person, armed with truth and nothing else, chooses to speak anyway. In a world drowning in noise, her clarity cut through like a blade. She didn't shout to be heard. She whispered and dared the silence to answer. What makes her story unforgettable is not the viral moment, not the vote, not the headlines. It's that she didn't need to win to change everything. She just needed to show up, to speak, to stay. She reminded a weary country that truth can still outlast power and that moral clarity, though rare, is more contagious than fear. The lesson wasn't just legal or political, it was human. That when power forgets its purpose, someone must remind it. And when policy becomes cruelty, someone must name it. And when justice hesitates, someone must walk into the fire and say, "Not today." So what do we do with a lesson like that? We remember Mariana, we remember Kilmar, we remember every silent name that didn't trend, every child without a camera, every parent who begged and was denied. We hold their stories like fire in our hands and refuse to let them go cold. We stop pretending that injustice is someone else's fight and start recognizing that silence too has fingerprints. And most of all, we remember Jasmine Crockett. Not because she was perfect, but because she was willing to stand, willing to speak, willing to risk being the only voice in a room built to drown her out. That is the human lesson. Justice does not begin in law. It begins in conscience. And if we dare to follow that voice, if we dare to become it, then maybe, just maybe, we can stop asking who gets to live and start becoming a country that no longer needs to. And if the lesson left behind by Jasmine Crockett still burns in your chest, if Mariana's scorched bear and Stephen Miller's silent exit still echo in your mind, then the time for watching is over. This story is not meant to be remembered. It is meant to be answered. Because injustice never vanishes on its own. It survives in the silence between moments like this and the action that must follow. So the question is no longer what did we witness? It is what will we do now? We must demand that our representatives push for full accountability, not just for Stephen Miller, but for every official who signed cruelty into law under the veil of procedure. We must vote, not just with ballots, but with presence, with protest, with relentless pressure to protect the powerless. We must write, speak, and organize like our democracy depends on it, because it does. We must build a system where no child's life is ever measured against a border map or a racial algorithm. We must rise not when the fire is raging, but when the ashes are still warm, because that's when change begins. And above all, we must never forget that the most dangerous policy is the one we pretend doesn't exist. Speak, act, push forward. Justice doesn't wait, and neither can we. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.